Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today is a real pleasure to welcome Mike Regan back to our podcast. Mike serves as co-founder and chief relationship officer at TranzAct Technologies. Mike is well known and active within the logistics industry. He serves on the boards of numerous industry groups, such as the National Shipper Strategic Council, formerly known as NASTRAC. It's now defunct, but it was a tremendous organization. And he also served as the chairman of the advocacy committee there, too. Mike is active in several other industry organizations, including the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, where he is a 2014 recipient of the Distinguished Service Award, and currently serves as the chairman of the YPO Manufacturing Excellence Network. Mike has been a featured contributor and published several blogs in industry periodicals such as Logistics Management, and he's been quoted in periodicals like the Wall Street Journal and many others. I'd also like to mention that this is Mike's third time joining us on the Logistics Management Podcast Series, and Mike is a very good friend of the magazine. Mike, welcome back.
Jeff, it's a real honor to be here with you today and looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely. And Mike, I think the timing is good to have you back, given the many moving parts, if you will, within all things freight, transportation, supply chain, and logistics. Why don't we sort of start at the top where we have in the past, Mike, and that simply is having to do with the state of the freight economy. So when I say freight economy to those in the audience, I'm sort of just thinking along the lines of sort of the things that drive goods movement. Or impact it negatively, perhaps, which is sort of what we're dealing with now when we think of inflation and housing and things like that. But Mike, I'll pass it over to you. How do you see things from the freight economy side these days?
Well, really, we have a bifurcated market, Jeff. And what I mean by that is that really it's a tale of two sectors, or not tale of two cities, but two modes. One of them is the truckload sector, and the other one is the LTL sector. And one of the things that it's just a reality is that we are currently still in and living through the most significant freight recession in modern times. And at the Stifel conference in February, they highlighted the fact that the normal freight recession lasts 12 to 14 months. And basically back in February, we were in the seventh quarter there, which would basically be 21 months. And they were saying we might come out of it by the end of the second quarter. Most of the people that I've talked to now say we'll be fortunate if we come out of it in the fourth quarter. So right now we are in, 24th, 25th month and the freight recession. But I say it's bifurcated into a tale of two cities, because it's had a much more profound impact on the truckload sector than it has on the LTL sector. And so what we have that rarely has happened is that normally in the freight markets, and I can go back to times that were really hot in the freight market versus times that were very, very soft. And the one thing you could always count on, Jeff, was that the LTL rates moved in tandem with the truckload rates. So the truckload rates were going up, LTL rates were going up, maybe by different percentages. Truckload rates could be going up 6-7%, LTL rates could be going up 3 or 4%, or vice versa. But what has made this particular freight market so unusual is it's not moving in tandem. In fact, what we've seen is that truckload rates have been very low because of softness in the market, while LTL rates have largely stayed intact, and LTL carriers are still asking for moderate but still getting increases.
Okay.
Now, some people have attributed that to the fact that with the closure of Yellow in August of last year, that in the snap of a finger eliminated 10% of the capacity in the LTL market. But what they overlook is even prior to Yellow is that we weren't necessarily seeing sharp discounting by the LTL carriers. So that basically broke the link between the truckload market and the LTL market.
Okay, understood. And when we look at sort of the mixed signals out there, Mike, and obviously there are a few, and by mixed signals, I'm talking about things like how retail, retail sales, for example, while not showing tremendous gains, to a degree, have been up, at a time when inflation slowly trickles down. Um, Import levels remain high, especially out on the West Coast, but we have the whole underlying theme of low demand. So how does that sort of get reconciled? And what is it? And what I'm basically leading to, Mike, is this is actually a question about capacity at the end of the day on the truckload side. How do those factors impact truckload capacity, and how is it reflected in the market environment that we're currently living in?
Boy, Jeff, that's a great question, and it's really got a couple of different parts. Uh, Avery Weiss, who you know very well from
Yes.
FTR, good friend of mine and yours as well. They FTR puts out some very, very interesting data points, but they talk about the fact that capacity wise, the number of carriers in the market today are roughly equal to, or even a little bit higher than pre-COVID numbers back to 2019. Now we have seen, you know, a moderate increase in bankruptcies, but not enough to significantly alter the capacity in the truckload market. We still have too much truckload capacity for the demand that's out there.
Sure.
And what's compounded that is you see in their quarterly earnings reports, people like Knight Swift, Warner, and JB Hunt saying that they are going to pull equipment from the contract market and put it in the spot market rather than accept contracts at the rates that shippers are expecting. So what's happened because the supply has exceeded the demand is basically going back to the fourth quarter of 2022, you had an inversion in the spot to contract market. So during the high demand of 2021 and into the first part of 2022, spot market rates were running anywhere from 70 to 90 cents above contract rates. Well, now that has been inverted, and spot rates are typically running, although they've come off the floor a little bit, but they are running at 60 to 80 cents below contract rates.
Okay.
Now we think we've seen signs that the market is in fact starting to rebound. But when you see big carriers like Knight Swift, Hunt, and Werner, three of the four biggest, largest truckload carriers, basically say we're not going to dedicate equipment in the contract market at the rates that shippers are expecting. It's a sign that clearly the supply and demand in the truckload sector has not evened out yet.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, short of having a crystal ball, when could we see some clarity in respect to that? I would assume it would have to require a few, maybe more than a few quarters to work ourselves out of that situation. Is that fair?
Well, Jeff, if I can just like be perfectly blunt, uh, most people have been predicting the end of the freight recession for the last year. As I
Right.
mentioned, we're already a year to a year and a half longer than the traditional freight recession.
Okay.
So that there's concerns. We are seeing some signs that demand is picking up. We have inventory restocking numbers to look at. FTR is also talked about, inventory day sales ratios, which indicate eventually people are going to have to, retailers are going to have to start carrying, or build up their inventories again.
Mhm.
But, the offset to that is consumer card debt, $1 trillion plus. The consumer who's been largely, you know, carrying the economy for a bit could be a little bit tired. So, what I just interviewed Gary Schilling. He's a noted economist.
Yes.
I interview Gary every 6 months, and for people that are interested, Jeff, they can go to transact.com and download it. It'll be out on Wednesday. But Gary brought up a very interesting point, which was the level of uncertainty in the market today. And that has an effect on the truckload market. It has an effect on the LTL. The LTL, as I keep coming back to, with the closure of Yellow, when you eliminate 10% of the capacity in the market overnight, that can cover up a lot of sins created by excess supply and not enough demand. So, it kind of level sets the supply and demand almost instantaneously. But that has not happened in the truckload market. And if I could, Jeff, this is this is our playground. We play in this a lot. We're in it every day.
Yeah.
But if you take a look at the top 25 LTL carriers, even the top 20, they control roughly about 80% of the LTL market. Okay. And if you go into the truckload sector and take the top 20 truckload carriers, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's going to be not even 30%, 30 to 35%. So
Right.
you
Yeah.
have that it's a big difference in the LTL versus truckload markets.
Yeah, I could have sworn I heard at an industry conference the 20% figure, but I cannot verify that. So, but yeah, 30% less or hovering around that. It's a big disparity to say the least.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, absolutely. So Mike, you had just touched upon inventories and something that's obviously tied very closely to inventories is peak season. Now,
Yeah.
to be sure, as we both well know, going back to the onset of the pandemic, peak season has taken on some different meanings for different industry stakeholders.
Yeah.
For those in the parcel slash last mile, e-commerce heavy influence sectors, it was kind of peak season all the time, obviously. During and after the pandemic for a while, possibly up to 2 years, maybe a little more. Um,
Yeah.
but it feels like, especially starting last year, if we were to use last year as a baseline, last year had a bit of a more normal feeling. Um, the notwithstanding all the many supply chain disruptions that we continue to see, unfortunately. But putting that to the side for a moment, how would you sort of size up or view this year's peak season, 2024? What could it look like? What might be in store?
Jeff, once again, great question. And I hate to disappoint your listeners because, I place a real premium on the value of your podcast. You guys do a great job covering it.
Thank you.
But what I'm saying is there are so many variables this year. If you could tell me what's going to happen with the Red Sea situation,
Yeah,
we're about to witness, for example, during the winter months in the Southern Hemisphere, the waters around the Cape of Good Hope, are some of the least navigable waters in the world. And then you take a look. I was just on a call here recently and, talking about companies and the need for supply chain resiliency. There are those that are forecasting that the East Coast could see an exceptionally potent hurricane season because of the impact of El Nino. Now, what we have seen is that, we had a tremendous amount of oversupply in the ocean market. Well, the Red Sea basically took up some of that capacity because it's added on each leg 12 to 15 days. So round trip, you're basically taking vessels 24 to 30 days longer to complete their journey. And so we've seen some rebound in the Trans-Pacific rate area. But the reason I say with peak season, if there are black swan events which could momentarily disrupt, uh, you know, capacity constraints, it wouldn't necessarily be because of quote unquote peak season. It's just that these black swan events have wiped out the excess capacity that was in the ocean market to
yeah,
give it look and appearance of black season, or peak season. Because here's what we do know, everyone there's economists, they say, have accurately predicted 9 of the last 2 recessions. So, you have been to a ton of conferences. You guys do a great job of covering it. But part of the reason I interviewed Gary Schilling this past week, and it's so valuable, which why I mentioned to go to TranzAct.com to listen to it, is because no one really knows what's going on with the Chinese economy. And the Chinese economy fuels a large part of the demand for the ocean carriers. So if it's as soft as people represent it to be, then the peak season, if there's tight capacity, peak season will be relatively light and moderate because of the lack of freight coming off of the Pacific and Pacific Rim countries. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how things shake out.
Yeah.
And so shifting closer to home, Mike, you can't help but notice a heavy emphasis or onus, whatever one wants to call it, on domestic supply chains. And part of it, well, not part of it, a big driver for that obviously is that in 2023, based on US Census Bureau data, the United States' new top trading partner is Mexico for the first time in, I believe, 2 decades. And we've heard a lot, and us here at LM have reported a lot about increased
Yeah.
nearshoring. Seen a lot of big players get heavily invested, whether it's in the Port of Laredo, Texas, or south of the border. I'm thinking C.H. Robinson, Ryder, Echo, all have made big news down there, saying going back to last fall. But I'd like to hear about how you think about the ongoing emergence of domestic supply chains slash nearshoring. I read and write and hear a lot about shorter lengths of haul, regional distribution efforts. How do you assess all of that stuff?
Hmm. Well, first of all, I don't mean to pop some balloons, but I think I saw a great chart that said, here is why nearshoring won't happen as fast or as big as people would like to think it is happening based
Hmm.
on some of the statistics. And that is the amount of manufacturing space in the United States is something like 1.5 billion square feet of space allocated to manufacturing production, right?
Sure.
China, that number is just shy of 1 billion square feet dedicated to manufacturing capacity. In Mexico, it's about 100 million.
Okay.
Okay. So we need to kind of keep things in perspective. Now, having said that, though, one of the things that everyone is living through as a result of 2021, when all of a sudden, when you see company after company acknowledging supply chain issues as impacting earnings, whether it was Target or, the list goes on and on and on, and Boeing's, and companies after companies, you say, okay, how do I reduce risk? And what happens when I lengthen my supply chain? We both know Yossi Sheffi. He's a good friend of mine.
Hmm.
And Yossi and David Levy, Simchi Levy talk about this. How do I deleverage my supply chain? And that's by bringing it closer to home. And the cost, the incremental cost associated with that, basically is is offset by the diminishing amount of risk I'm accepting in my supply chain. And so one of the things that I would say, while everyone's been focused on nearshoring, 2 weeks ago I was out at Arizona where one of our customers is standing up a 260,000 square foot facility in Buckeye, Arizona.
Okay.
And what I watched there is the level of automation that's going to be introduced into that manufacturing facility, is going to exponentially increase their productivity. And, job wise, it's, they'll sell more, that it's a great, great, great company. So as companies look to automate and, you take a look at the robotization of the supply chain, I think that that's something that is going to have a potentially more immediate impact on companies that basically want to gain control over the supply chain, in North American based, whatever it is, it'll help. The one thing too, Jeff, that I would just say, and I think this is critically important, is that, obviously Mexico, you cite the fact, number one trading partner, but that doesn't come without some level of risk as well.
Sure.
And the Chinese, you guys have done a great job covering this. Right now, the Chinese are on a furious buying spree in Mexico. And I think we are witnessing some concerns because it's not just that it's made in China, but it's the emerging enmity between the United States and China that I think is causing some level of concern. Not
Okay.
to inject politics into it, but I think that's something that savvy supply chain strategists are looking at.
Right. No, it's a point well taken. Um, and just a few more quick things, Mike, here. And I just was looking at some of our previous podcast recordings that you and I have done. And one interesting topic that we have covered in the past was the intersection of the C-suite and logistics slash supply chain. Uh,
Yeah.
how it's grown, how it's evolved over time. Obviously, the pandemic had a large role there. But you're hearing more about it on global or large public company earnings calls, supply chain operations, optimization, whatever, than you ever did in the past.
Yep.
Um, and
Absolutely.
the Targets, the Walmarts, it's gone from this required cost center kind of thing to this real competitive strength or advantage for a company. How do you sort of view maybe an updated version of the intersection of C-suite and logistics slash supply chain operations?
Well, that's once again, Jeff, you're right on the spot. And let me just tell you, one of the interviews that I did was the number two guy at Amazon. He reported directly to Jeff Bezos and retired about 30 to 45 days before Jeff, or he would have replaced Jeff when Jeff retired. His
Okay.
name was Jeff Wilkie. And one of the things that it was a fabulous interview. It's been listened to thousands of times. And one of the things he talked about Amazon's strategy was to create a supply chain which would give them a sustainable competitive advantage because it would allow them to do things at a lower cost than its competitors who said they had to match what Amazon was doing. And so that intersectionality is when people take a look and say, is my supply chain an asset or an anchor? And if it's an anchor, if every one of your competitors also has a supply chain that's an anchor, you're okay. But if you have some of your competitors are like Amazon and see it as an asset and you're an anchor, you're up the proverbial creek without a visible means of locomotion because you're dragging that anchor along. And I would just say, Jeff, if I could give some professional advice to members of your audience out there, okay? Because, you and I have known each other for a lot of years, and Lord knows I've given enough talks on this, about career insurance. I had somebody said to me, Mike, could you give me some professional advice? And I said, with the intersectionality of your supply chain, your C-suite coming to you in the supply chain front lines, there's this thing called the iceberg of ignorance. And it was founded by, no, I'm not making this up. It was a Japanese consultant in the late 90s. And basically it said that the C-suite knows about 4% of the problems that are actually affecting the company's supply chain, the C-suite.
Yeah.
And the people on the front line know 100%. So what happens is that the C-suite is counting on the people on the front lines, a lot of whom are your listeners, to bring and raise this stuff up. But here's the problem. The people on the front lines don't know how to do that. How do I get the attention of my CFO? How do I get the attention of my COO? How do I get my chief supply chain officer or my CEO or president? And so, in my, you mentioned I was the past chairman, not the current one. So my bio needs to be updated.
Yes.
I would say to people, if you want the biggest career enhancing thing to do, learn how to ask, can you help me? Because I'll tell you flat out, Jeff, there are resources like what you're doing, logistics management. There's resources like what TranzAct's doing. A lot of this stuff is free, but people, because they don't know, maybe they're reluctant to ask. Maybe their ego's in the way and they won't ask. But at the end of the day, here's what's going to happen. If you don't ask for help and your C-suite executives conclude that somebody else can ask and get that help, you're out of a job.
Hmm.
And so I would just ask your listeners to take a pause here, think about this, and ask, am I willing to be vulnerable and not have to worry, oh my gosh, they'll find out I don't know this. Ask, can you help me? Because example, Jeff, and I'm rambling here, but let me bring it home.
No. Go ahead.
We are seeing sourcing strategies which are relevant to a market that existed 5 to 10 years ago, and they're sub-optimizing the results because they're not doing what they need to do to get the best possible results with their sourcing strategy. And I talk about this activity-based sourcing model. It's transformative. It produces killer results. in very few companies, shippers are applying it because they don't know and they're not willing to ask for help. And so my question is, if you're working in a company and these C-level executives go to all these conferences and they find out how great their competitors are doing, ultimately they're going to say, well, why aren't we as good as our competitors?
Yeah.
And that's why you need to take advantage of what logistics management offers. These webcast podcasts, pick up the phone. People say, well, you're so hard to get a hold of. If you call my cell phone, Jeff, what do I say? If you don't hear back from me in 24 hours, call the police.
That's
And so the help is there,
yep.
but you need to be willing to ask for it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that actually, Mike, is a nice tee up for what I wanted to close with, was just simply just given the visibility, given the types of customers that you have. If you could just shed a light, and this sort of goes back to many of the themes of the old days when we would always meet up at NASTRAC, and that simply is three words, and I'd like to hear you describe the current state of them or what needs to happen. It's just simply shipper carrier collaboration. Is it still an ongoing, evolving thing, kind of searching for the holy grail of that? Or is it still sort of squabbling over price? Is it something in the middle? Where do things stand? I know that's probably instance by instance type question, but on a top level, on a general level, how would you view that?
Okay, let me break it down as succinctly as I possibly can. Every one of your shippers on this podcast, listening to this podcast, need to ask the following question: am I a strategic or transactional shipper? Okay.
Okay.
If I'm transactional, I'm in the market getting the lowest possible rate each day. But Derek Leathers, who's a friend of mine with Werner, brings it out that people who think transactionally or strategically over the life of the contract will always do better than people who look transactionally. So first
Okay.
question is this: am I transactional or am I strategic? The second thing that I would say, it's the battle of data. Okay.
Okay.
Recognize that shipper carrier collaboration requires data so that we're seeing the same set of facts. And one of the things I'm intensely proud of here at TranzAct is we give shippers great data, but guess what? Their carriers also have great data. So if you're not asking carriers questions that are relevant to their operating ratio, and you're going into negotiations not even aware of that, trust me, you will get suboptimum results. So we
Sure.
have the battle of data. And then the final thing is what I mentioned before, the willingness to ask for help. And that's when when you're dealing with people, there's a thing, and I'm not making this up, Jeff. Believe me, I'm not. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, where
Okay.
people are consciously incompetent because they don't know what they don't know. The best way you can battle the Dunning-Kruger effect is by stepping up and being vulnerable and saying, teach me or
Okay.
share with me. That help?
Yeah, 100%. And that is a great place to wrap up for today's
Perfect.
podcast, Mike. So, on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to say thanks again for joining us for the third time. And because we're in hockey playoffs, you've scored a hat trick.
Jeff, listen, I love it. You guys do a great job. So please keep it up. And anytime you will be invite me, I'm there for you. It's a
Yeah,
real privilege
absolutely.
and an honor. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And for those in the audience, Mike is on LinkedIn, so feel free to send him a LinkedIn invitation. It'd be easy to find there. And if you want to learn more about TranzAct Technologies and their services, simply go to tranzact.com. That's with a Z, TranzAct.com. And for those of you on Twitter, please feel free to go ahead and give us at Logistics Management a follow, simply at Logistics MGMT. And if you're not subscribing to Supply Chain 24/7, please do. Just look for it wherever you get your podcast. Just punch in Supply Chain 24/7 and it will come right up. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day. And we look forward to seeing you next time.